It has been an exhausting last few weeks, but the final votes have been cast in the 2018 midterm election. While many of those votes are still getting tallied, the results for Congress and the Senate are largely settled. And it looks like that the Democrats have indeed regained control over the House of Representatives, while the Republicans have shored up their majority in the Senate. And because I am filming this at literally 6 o'clock in the morning and I have gotten zero sleep, so today's video talking about what happened is sponsored by caffeine. Caffeine! Nothing blocks off the receptors in your brains telling you that you need to sleep quite like caffeine. Commonly offered in two addicting varieties, black and bitter bean water and hot leaf juice. Last week I asked you guys to put in your guesses for how many seats the Democrats would have in the House and how many the Republicans would have in the Senate, as well as what the two-party vote between the two would be once the dust settled. I was hoping that, the final projections would have come in by now, would have been available by this morning, but there are a lot of very tight races left. Many of those elections could swing either way, so we unfortunately do not have the final numbers for that, so we're going to instead move the announcement of who won that little contest next week. Prior to the election, Republicans had 235 seats in the House, Democrats had 193, and there were 7 vacant seats. Now, not all of the votes have been tallied yet, but it looks like Republicans are expected to have about 206 seats, while Democrats are going to have 229, thus giving them the majority in the chamber. In the Senate, Republicans had 51 seats, and the Democrats effectively had 49, since both independent members, Bernie Sanders and Angus King, caucus with the Democrats. Now, some of those races are also too tight to call, but it is expected that Republicans will have anywhere between 52 to 54 seats when the final votes are in. What do we know about the districts that switch between Republican and Democratic control and vice versa? This is a map of what party represented the nation's 435 congressional districts prior to the election. And this map shows the leaning after the election, the orange being races that are still too close to call. There were 33 Republican seats that shifted over to the Democrats, but 7 shifted over to the Republicans for a net Democratic gain of 26 at this point. Now that number is subject to fluctuations, as there are still a number of very tight races that have yet to be decided, and those could be figured out over the next few hours or even over the next few days. So you can expect that the net Democratic gain will shift as those races come in. However, even if all of the undecided seats swing to the Republican Party, the Democrats will still regain control over the House. This general outcome that the Democrats would regain the House was perhaps a bit of an inevitability given what districts were competitive this cycle. If you look at reports leading up to election night, there was something like 80 seats that the Democrats could capitalize on, and they only needed like 28 to 30 in order to regain the chamber. If you think of these things like as a coin toss, it's really not surprising that Democrats managed to take control of the House when they really only needed like just over a quarter of the available seats. I mean, if we want to get technical, it's like 37.5%, but I didn't want to do fractions in that moment because, again, no sleep. There were some general patterns that could be gleaned from the results. Most of the seats that shifted from Republican to Democratic control were in districts that were more educated than the average district held by the GOP. They were also more affluent, with the average household earning over $15,000 more per year than in other GOP-controlled districts, and they also polled lower in support for President Trump in the 2016 election. Democratic seats that flipped over to Republican control, they were generally less well educated than the average Democratic district, and they tended to poll better for President Trump in the 2016 election. At this point, I want to make a really quick caveat. Analyses like these tend to suggest that things like education, income, middling Trump support, etc. means that you probably had some people switch their vote from Republican to Democrat, or that Trump supporters, flipped and voted for the Democratic candidate, or that certain Democrats switched and voted for the GOP. But that's probably not what happened. Partisan defection may be higher in midterm races than in presidential elections, but it's still very, very low. Some people undoubtedly change their mind, but they're the exception. What's probably happening is that those more affluent and more well-educated Republicans just didn't turn out to vote. These qualities probably spurred on participation in Democrats this cycle and depressed it in Republicans, as opposed to making Republicans vote for Democrats or Democrats vote for Republicans. Looking at the Senate, we see a similar story, but with the party switched. Most of the seats were in the Republican favor, as the Democrats were on the defensive this cycle. Just as it's not totally unlikely to get, 2 or 3 heads up in a row when you're flipping a coin, it's not really as much of a surprise that it broke the way it did, with Republicans gaining a little bit of support in the Senate. There was a lot of talk prior to the election about how it was going to be heavily contingent on turnout. Democrats were really expecting to have higher turnout among groups that were already favorable to them, such as young people, women, and minorities. Republicans were also hoping that members of their base would turn out, generally whites and men, in order to stem the tide of the blue wave. And that they did. It'll take a couple of days before we know for sure, but we've seen far higher turnout than we did in 2014. Like, Texas's early vote was higher than the state's entire turnout in 2014. The Republicans would have a much worse night if they didn't manage to mobilize their base. In the Senate, the states that tended to be up for grabs were those that were predominantly white and broke for Trump pretty strongly in 2016. That picture would have been made a whole heck of a lot worse if the Democrats were not able to drum up support among their base. While we can't speak to whether or not turnout was higher among certain groups for a little while yet, that data won't be released for a few weeks, if not for a few months, right now it appears that women and Latinos comprised a larger proportion of the electorate than they had in 2014. Blacks comprised a slightly lower proportion, and young people, those between the ages of 18 to 29, were roughly the same. This figure is subject to change as more data comes in, but I don't expect it to really change too dramatically. I'll include something in next week's office hours if it does though. One obvious question is, how much was this a referendum on President Trump? And the answer to that really depends on who you asked. About 65% of voters queried through exit polling said that their vote had something to do with President Trump. Of that 65%, 60% of them said that their vote was against the president. Ultimately, about 70% of Democrats said that their vote was against President Trump, while 28% said that it had really nothing to do with him. 57% of Republicans said that their vote was for him, but nearly 40% said that their vote had nothing to do with him. He appeared to matter both to Democrats and Republicans, but he mattered more, or at least he seemed to have mattered more to the former. So what does this all mean going forward? Well, President Trump is obviously going to have a difficult time getting the money for priorities such as the border wall. This is especially the case because, according to the Constitution, the House has the power of the purse. They're the ones who start the appropriations process. Democrats are probably not going to be very keen on letting Trump's wall get funded fully, not without some, substantial concessions on other important issues. This doesn't mean that the Democrats are completely in the clear here, though. Quite the contrary, they might have actually put themselves in a bit of an electoral pickle. See, the House doesn't just start the appropriations process, it's also where the first step of the impeachment process takes place. Activist members of both parties' bases know this, of course. Republican activists have been insisting that the first thing the Democrats will do is draw up articles of impeachment against the president should they win the House. Many Democratic activists have been calling for his impeachment literally since before he was even sworn in. And there's a sizable proportion of the Democratic base that was mobilized by the promise of either removing Trump from office or substantially curtailing his ability to do anything moving forward. But that's not the advertised position of any of the Democrats who have just been elected. The party's stance is that they want the Mueller investigation to conclude without any executive interference. They've hinted that they would potentially, start the impeachment proceedings if there was an attempt to interfere, but they probably wouldn't do it otherwise. This lack of action is going to leave a lot of their activists extremely disappointed and contribute to the overall image of the Democratic Party being ineffectual. On top of that, they also ran on trying to reform the immigration system, trying to pass universal health care or something, akin to it, trying to reform our prison and police systems. Basically, they offered a lot of really ambitious policies. Democrats are going to be going into 2020 with very little to show. The Republicans will undoubtedly marshal a message that the Democrats are obstructing the president's agenda. And, they probably won't be wrong. It won't be easy for them to drum up the support necessary to retain the seats that they just won, not to mention beating the president. They're going to have to hope that this victory wasn't too cathartic and that the anger felt about the president and the GOP will continue going forward. Now, in this, they are probably going to be helped by the president's chronic inability to not trigger a colossal controversy and the GOP's wariness at alienating his small but dedicated base. Research on political behavior shows that emotions are very important at getting people out the door, with anger and anxiety being among the strongest motivators. So if the president keeps doing things to make people mad, then Democrats' difficult task is at least made a tad bit easier. There's also some talk about this being part of a broader realignment between the two parties. Now, this election symbolizes or is the catalyst of a change over who the Republicans represent and what they stand for, and who the Democrats represent and what they stand for. While, continuing the theme of today's episode, it's too early to say for sure, I think that more likely than not, this is an election that sets the stage for a realignment as opposed to being one itself. You have a large division within the Republican Party right now. Those who are more for classical ideas of conservatism, limited government and the like, and those who are for more active government intervention in social policies or otherwise motivated by things like racism and racial animus. This division has been deepening since the election of President Obama, but it's always been there. Just as the party worked to expel the more liberal Rockefeller Republicans in the 1950s and 1960s, it looks like many on the right are trying to expel those who aren't as far right as them on these social, religious, and cultural issues. If they succeed, we might just indeed see that shift, but I don't think that this is the shift. I think it's another battle in the war over what the party stands for. And actually, since the GOP just got a really good thumping, by emphasizing moral issues as opposed to how good the economy is doing right now, and it is doing very, very good, the upper hand might actually be with the more traditional conservatives. I also see something similar going on with the Democrats, right? Like, the party is fighting over whether to embrace the more moderate approaches to things or things that are decidedly pushed further to the left. Their internal fighting is also centered around, socio-cultural issues, but they're often expressed through the lens of socioeconomic inequality and or racial justice. But that internal fighting isn't really as pronounced right now. Maybe it helps to have a common enemy like the GOP did with President Obama back, during his tenure. I honestly don't know. And since I'm beginning to ramble and start slurring my words, now's probably a good time to wrap up filming the video. I'm looking forward to reading your guys' thoughts about the midterm election, so please just drop them down in the comment section below. Look forward to reading all of them, answering a few in next week's office hours. In addition to the predictions, we had some other comments that I felt merited mentioning and addressing, so let's get into those. See, I knew there'd be one totally going to ignore the fact that I brought it on myself, but see, there was somebody. This didn't exactly age well, did it? And for what it's worth, from one conservative to another, or at least, from one conservative to someone who's conflating conservatism with authoritarianism, the whole wanting to lock up those you disagree with politically reeks of fascism. It's not a good look. We've literally gone to wars over this. It's not even a question. I also want to thank those like Dorian Sapiens who voiced additional support for the puns. I promise to do what I can to deploy them as often as I can and to make them as, as punny as possible. I would say that that's all the time that we have for today, but frankly, that's just all the energy I have for today. So thank you guys so much for your comments. Please, please, please keep them coming. Links for everything, as always, will be down in the doobie-doo, as well as links to Facebook, Twitter, and the blog. Look forward to seeing you guys out there as well. If you enjoyed this video, hope you consider giving it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, and by subscribing to the channel to stay in the loop for more awesome social science content is uploaded. If you want to be guaranteed to be in the loop when I upload a new video, be sure to click the bell icon as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.